The morning sun painted the Pacific crimson as Admiral Chuichi Nagumo gazed across the endless expanse of water from the bridge of the carrier Akagi. It was June 4th, 1942, and the combined fleet had sailed with the confidence of gods behind him. The pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy stretched across the horizon for aircraft carriers, their decks bristling with Zeros and dive bombers that had brought the Americans to their knees at Pearl Harbor just 6 months earlier. Commander Mitsuo Fukuda adjusted his flight goggles and studied the reconnaissance reports. The Americans were somewhere out there, hiding like wounded animals after their humiliating defeats across the Pacific. The capture of Midway Atoll would complete Japan's defensive perimeter and draw the remnants of the U.S. Pacific Fleet into a decisive battle where they could be crushed once and for all. "Sir, first-wave aircraft are ready for launch," reported Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. The young officer had trained for this day his entire life, the day when Japanese naval aviation would demonstrate its absolute superiority over the barbarian Americans. Nagumo nodded, his weathered face betraying none of the anxiety that gnawed at his stomach. Intelligence reports suggested the Americans had only a handful of ships left after their disasters at Wake Island and the Philippines. Still, something felt different about this morning. The wind carried an ominous stillness that reminded him of the moments before a typhoon strikes. As the first wave of aircraft roared off the deck of Akagi, their engines singing the song of imperial conquest, none of the Japanese officers could have imagined that this would be the last time their carriers would launch a coordinated strike. The doctrine of decisive battle that had guided Japanese naval strategy for decades was about to collide with American ingenuity and desperate courage. Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey adjusted his compass heading from the deck of the Enterprise, his eyes scanning the vast Pacific for any sign of the Japanese fleet. The Americans had broken the Japanese naval codes, giving Admiral Chester Nimitz unprecedented insight into enemy intentions. But knowledge alone wouldn't win this battle. It would take precision, timing, and the kind of luck that desperate men sometimes find when their backs are against the wall. The American pilots knew they were outnumbered and outgunned. Their Devastator torpedo bombers were slow and vulnerable, their Wildcat fighters no match for the legendary Zero in a dogfight. Yet they carried something the Japanese had not counted on: the fury of men fighting for their homeland and the innovative tactics born from necessity rather than doctrine. As the morning progressed, both fleets moved toward their fateful encounter, unaware that the next few hours would reshape the entire course of the Pacific War. The Japanese, drunk on 6 months of uninterrupted victory, sailed forward with the confidence of eagles. The Americans, bloodied but unbroken, prepared to stake everything on a single, desperate gamble. By noon, the smoke would rise across the eastern horizon, and the myth of Japanese invincibility would burn alongside their carriers in the deep blue waters of the Pacific. The radio crackled with urgent voices as Admiral Raymond Spruance stood on the bridge of the Enterprise, his calm demeanor masking the enormous pressure resting on his shoulders. At exactly 600 hours on June 4th, 1942, American reconnaissance planes had spotted the Japanese fleet approaching Midway. The trap was set, but success depended on split-second timing and the courage of pilots who would likely not return from their missions. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay checked his instruments one final time as his squadron of Devastator torpedo bombers prepared for launch. These aircraft were death-trap slow, lumbering targets that had to fly straight and level during their attack runs, making them easy prey for Japanese fighters. Yet Lindsay and his men understood that their sacrifice might buy the dive bombers precious time to reach their targets. According to historical accounts from the Naval History and Heritage Command, the American strategy relied on overwhelming the Japanese combat air patrol through coordinated attacks from multiple directions. The plan was audacious in its simplicity. Torpedo bombers would attack low, drawing the Zeros down to sea level, while dive bombers struck from above at the moment when enemy fighters were out of position. Meanwhile, aboard the Japanese flagship Akagi, Admiral Nagumo faced the first of several critical decisions that would determine the fate of his fleet. His aircraft had successfully attacked Midway's defenses, but Lieutenant Tomonaga's report indicated a second strike would be necessary to neutralize the island's airfield. The admiral ordered his reserve aircraft to be rearmed with land attack bombs instead of the armor-piercing weapons needed for naval combat. Commander Fukuda watched with growing unease as ordnance crews frantically worked to rearm the aircraft. Bombs and torpedoes littered the hangar decks as sailors rushed to complete the changeover. The careful preparations that had characterized Japanese naval operations for decades were giving way to hasty improvisation, a dangerous sign that the initiative was slipping away. At 7:55 hours, the first wave of American attackers appeared on the horizon. Torpedo Squadron 8, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, came in low and fast, their obsolete devastators struggling against the superior speed and firepower of the Japanese fleet. The Zero fighters dove to intercept, their guns blazing. As they tore through the American formation, Waldron's voice crackled over the radio one final time. "Watch those fighters. See that splash? How do you like that, you sons of bitches?" Moments later, his aircraft plunged into the Pacific, followed by every other plane in his squadron except one Ensign George Gay, who would spend the next 30 hours floating in the water, witnessing the battle that would change history. The sacrifice of Torpedo Squadron 8 was repeated again and again, as waves of American attackers pressed home their attacks against overwhelming odds. Squadron after squadron was decimated by Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire, their crews paying the ultimate price for a strategy that seemed to be failing catastrophically. But high above the carnage, unseen by the Japanese defenders focused on the torpedo bombers, Lieutenant Commander McCluskey's dive bombers were approaching their targets. The Zeros that should have been protecting the carriers were still at sea level, finishing off the last of the torpedo planes. The Japanese had won every tactical engagement of the morning, but in their moment of triumph, they had left themselves fatally exposed. At exactly 10:22 hours, the war in the Pacific pivoted on a single moment of devastating clarity. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, his fuel gauge showing dangerously low levels, spotted the wake of a Japanese destroyer racing northward. Following his instincts, he led his dive bombers along that white line of foam and found himself staring down at the most beautiful sight an American naval aviator could imagine for Japanese aircraft carriers spread across the blue Pacific. Like sitting ducks. The Akagi, flagship of the combined fleet, had her flight deck crowded with aircraft being hurriedly rearmed. Bombs and fuel lines snaked across the deck as ordnance crews worked frantically to prepare for the second strike against Midway. Admiral Nagumo had just received the stunning news that American ships were approaching from the northeast, forcing him to order another armament change, this time back to anti-ship weapons. Lieutenant Richard Best rolled into his dive, the earth spinning beneath his dauntless as he plunged toward the Akagi at terminal velocity. His bomb bay doors opened with a mechanical thunk that he felt more than heard. Over the screaming wind, below him, Japanese sailors looked up in shock as they realized their protective fighter screen had been drawn away by the torpedo bombers. The first bomb struck the Akagi's flight deck with a sound like thunder, penetrating to the hangar deck where aviation fuel and armed aircraft waited like a carefully prepared funeral pyre. The explosion ripped through the carrier's vitals, setting off a chain reaction that would consume the pride of the Japanese fleet. Secondary explosions followed as stored ordnance detonated, sending pillars of flame and smoke hundreds of feet into the air. Simultaneously, other dive bomber groups found their targets. The Kaga, veteran of countless battles, took multiple hits that started fires throughout her length. Her flight deck buckled and twisted under the force of internal explosions as aviation gasoline fed the flames. The Soryu, smallest of the four carriers, was struck by bombs that turned her into a floating inferno within minutes. Commander Fukuda, wounded in the initial attack, watched in horror as his world collapsed around him. The carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor, conquered the Dutch East Indies, and humiliated the Royal Navy in the Indian Ocean were dying before his eyes. The smoke that rose from their burning hulks would be visible for miles, a funeral pyre for Japanese naval supremacy. Admiral Nagumo, his face ashen with shock, transferred his flag to the cruiser Nagara as the Akagi was consumed by flames. The carefully orchestrated plan to destroy the American fleet had become a nightmare of burning ships and desperate damage control efforts. In the space of 5 minutes, the balance of power in the Pacific had shifted irrevocably. The Hiryu, furthest from the American dive bombers, escaped the initial attack and immediately began preparing a counterstrike. Her aircraft, led by Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi, would soon be winging their way toward the American fleet in a desperate attempt to salvage something from the disaster. But the damage was already done. 3 of Japan's 6 fleet carriers were burning wrecks, and with them died the dream of Japanese naval dominance. As the smoke rose across the eastern horizon, visible from Midway itself, the men who had planned and executed this perfect attack began to understand that they had witnessed something unprecedented in naval warfare. The age of the battleship was ending, and the aircraft carrier had proven both its decisive power and its terrible vulnerability. The Americans had gambled everything on a single, coordinated strike, and their desperate courage had paid off beyond their wildest dreams. The smoke from 3 burning carriers had barely begun to dissipate when Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi aboard the Hiryu made the most crucial decision of his naval career. Unlike his colleagues, who had been paralyzed by the shock of the American attack, Yamaguchi possessed the clarity of mind that comes to exceptional leaders in moments of crisis. At 1100 hours on June 4, 1942, he ordered every available aircraft into the air for a counterstrike against the American fleet. Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi led 18 dive bombers and 6 fighters from the Hiryu's deck, their engines roaring defiance against the disaster that had befallen the combined fleet. These pilots represented the finest naval aviators in the world, men who had perfected their craft in the skies over China and had proven their mastery at Pearl Harbor. If anyone could salvage victory from this catastrophe, it would be these warriors of the rising sun. The American fleet, meanwhile, was celebrating their unprecedented success while remaining grimly aware that the battle was far from over. Admiral Spruance, displaying the cool judgment that would make him legendary, ordered his ships to maintain course and speed. While preparing for the inevitable Japanese counterattack, the Enterprise and Hornet continued launching combat air patrols, their pilots exhausted but determined to protect their ships. At 1200 hours, radar operators aboard the American ships detected the approaching Japanese strike force. The Yorktown, already damaged from the Battle of the Coral Sea, but patched up enough to fight, became the primary target as Kobayashi's bombers dove through the American fighter screen. The Japanese pilots, flying with the desperate precision of men who knew their empire's fate hung in the balance, pressed their attacks with suicidal courage. The first bomb struck the Yorktown's flight deck with devastating effect, penetrating deep into the ship's interior and starting fires that quickly spread throughout the vessel. A second hit knocked out her power plant, leaving the carrier dead in the water as damage control parties fought to save her. The Japanese pilots, their fuel running low and their ammunition expended, turned for home with the satisfaction of having drawn American blood. But Admiral Yamaguchi was not finished. Despite having lost most of his experienced pilots in the morning's disaster, he ordered a second strike using every remaining aircraft aboard the Hiryu. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, the same officer who had led the first attack on Midway, volunteered to lead this desperate mission despite his aircraft being damaged and his fuel tanks nearly empty. The second Japanese attack found the Yorktown's crew performing miracles of damage control. In just 1 hour, they had restored power, extinguished the fires, and gotten the carrier moving again. When the Japanese torpedo bombers arrived, they found what appeared to be an undamaged ship and pressed their attack with renewed hope. 2 torpedoes struck the Yorktown's port side, flooding several compartments and causing a severe list that made further flight operations impossible. The order to abandon ship was given. Though the tough carrier would survive this battle and many others, the Japanese pilots, having expended their lives and aircraft in this final gambit, had achieved a Pyrrhic victory that would not change the ultimate outcome of the battle. As the afternoon wore on, Admiral Yamaguchi realized that his counterstrike had failed to achieve its strategic objectives. The American fleet remained operational, while his own force was reduced to a single carrier facing overwhelming odds. The initiative had passed completely to the Americans, and the proud combined fleet was in full retreat for the first time in the war. The smoke that continued to rise from the burning Japanese carriers served as a stark reminder that the tide of war had turned. What had begun as a carefully planned operation to destroy the American fleet had become a disaster of unprecedented proportions for the Imperial Japanese Navy. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon when Admiral Spruance made the decision that would complete the destruction of the Japanese carrier force. At 1500 hours, he ordered a final strike against the Hiryu, the last operational Japanese carrier. The Enterprise and Hornet, their decks still scarred from the morning's frantic operations, launched every available aircraft in a coordinated attack that would seal Japan's fate. Lieutenant Commander Earl Gallagher led the dive bombers from the Enterprise, his aircraft loaded with 1,000-pound bombs that would complete the work begun that morning. The American pilots, exhausted from hours of combat, drew upon reserves of determination they didn't know they possessed. Behind them flew the aviators from the Hornet, equally determined to ensure that no Japanese carrier would escape to threaten American shores again. Aboard the Hiryu, Admiral Yamaguchi stood on the bridge watching the approaching American aircraft with the stoic acceptance of a samurai facing his final battle. His ship had launched every available plane into desperate counterstrikes, leaving her decks nearly empty and her defenses minimal. The Zero fighters that remained were outnumbered 10-1, their pilots flying on fumes and courage alone. The American attack commenced at 1700 hours. With the precision of a well-rehearsed symphony of destruction, dive bombers plunged from 15,000 feet, their engines screaming as they built up speed for their final approach. The Hiryu's anti-aircraft guns opened fire, filling the sky with black puffs of smoke and deadly shrapnel. But the American pilots pressed home their attacks with the determination of men who knew they were making history, for bombs struck the Hiryu in rapid succession, each one adding to the inferno that had already consumed her sisters. The flight deck buckled and collapsed as internal explosions tore through the carrier's frame. Aviation fuel fed the flames that rose hundreds of feet into the air, creating a pillar of smoke that would be visible for miles across the Pacific. Admiral Yamaguchi, refusing offers to evacuate to an escort vessel, chose to remain aboard his flagship as she burned. In a final radio message to the combined fleet, he accepted full responsibility for the disaster and recommended that Japan seek peace before the Americans could bring their full industrial might to bear. His words, transmitted as the Hiryu's communications equipment failed, would haunt Japanese naval leadership for the remainder of the war. As night fell on June 4, 1942, the four most powerful aircraft carriers in the Japanese fleet were either sunk or sinking. The Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu represented not just ships, but the accumulated experience and training of Japan's finest naval aviators. Their destruction eliminated the core of Japanese naval aviation in a single day, a blow from which the Imperial Navy would never recover. The smoke that rose from the burning carriers was visible from Midway itself, where the defenders who had endured the morning's bombardment now watched in amazement as their attackers' fleet was consumed by flames. The strategic implications were immediately clear. To military observers on both sides, Japan had lost not just for carriers, but the trained pilots and aircraft that made them effective fighting units. Commander Fukuda, pulled from the water by a Japanese destroyer, would later write that the sight of the burning carriers marked the beginning of the end for Japanese naval power. The carefully husbanded resources that had taken years to build had been squandered in a single day's fighting, leaving Japan vulnerable to the American counteroffensive that would surely follow. Dawn on June 5, 1942, revealed the full scope of the disaster that had befallen the combined fleet. The four carriers that had been the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy were gone, taking with them over 3,000 officers and men whose training and experience could not be replaced. Admiral Yamamoto, receiving the reports aboard his flagship Yamato, realized that his carefully planned decisive battle had instead handed the Americans their most significant victory of the war. The strategic implications of the defeat were immediately apparent to Japanese naval leadership. The loss of 4 fleet carriers represented more than just ships. It was the destruction of Japan's trained naval aviation cadre, the elimination of hundreds of experienced pilots, and the end of Japanese offensive capability in the Pacific. The dream of establishing a defensive perimeter that would force America to negotiate a favorable peace had died with the carriers. Captain Mitsuo Fukuda, one of the few senior aviation officers to survive the battle, would later describe the scene as the funeral of Japanese naval aviation. The men who had planned and executed the attack on Pearl Harbor were either dead or floating in life rafts, their aircraft resting on the bottom of the Pacific alongside the ships they had served. The American victory was complete but costly. The Yorktown, despite the heroic efforts of her crew, would be sunk by a Japanese submarine 2 days later while under tow. However, the loss of 1 damaged carrier was a small price to pay for the elimination of Japan's primary offensive weapon. Admiral Nimitz, receiving reports of the battle in Hawaii, understood that the strategic balance in the Pacific had shifted decisively in America's favor. The psychological impact of the defeat on Japanese morale was perhaps even more significant than the material losses. For 6 months, the Imperial Navy had seemed invincible, conquering territory from the Aleutians to the Solomon Islands with apparent ease. The sudden reversal at Midway shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility and demonstrated that American industrial might, combined with tactical innovation, could overcome even the most experienced enemy forces. In Tokyo, the news of the defeat was suppressed by military censors who feared its impact on civilian morale. The families of the lost airmen were told their sons had died gloriously in victory, while the true scope of the disaster remained hidden from the Japanese public. This policy of deception would continue throughout the war, preventing the Japanese people from understanding the hopelessness of their situation. The Battle of Midway marked the beginning of Japan's long retreat across the Pacific. Without the carrier-based aviation that had been the foundation of their early victories, Japanese forces would be forced to fight defensive battles against an increasingly powerful American war machine. The initiative had passed to the United States, and it would never return to Japanese hands. Admiral Spruance, in his after-action report, noted that the victory demonstrated the importance of intelligence, timing, and the courage of individual pilots willing to sacrifice themselves for their country. The combination of code-breaking, tactical innovation, and desperate bravery had achieved what many had thought impossible: the defeat of the seemingly invincible Japanese fleet. The smoke that had risen from the burning carriers on June 4th would serve as a funeral pyre for Japanese naval supremacy, and the beacon that lit America's path to victory in the Pacific War. The weeks following the Battle of Midway revealed the true magnitude of Japan's defeat. As reports filtered back to Tokyo through the military's rigid command structure, Admiral Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack and Japan's most respected naval strategist, understood that the loss of 4 fleet carriers had fundamentally altered the strategic balance in the Pacific. In a private meeting with Emperor Hirohito on June 20th, 1942, he delivered the devastating assessment that Japan could no longer hope to win a decisive victory against the United States. The human cost of the battle was staggering and irreplaceable. Japan had lost not just ships, but the cream of its naval aviation pilots, who had trained for years and possessed combat experience that could not be quickly replaced. Lieutenant Commander Shigekazu Shimazaki, one of the few dive bomber leaders to survive, reported that the Imperial Navy had lost the backbone of our air power in a single day's fighting. In contrast, American industrial capacity was already beginning to demonstrate its awesome potential. New carriers were under construction in shipyards across the United States, and pilot training programs were producing aviators at a rate that dwarfed Japanese capabilities. The Essex-class carriers, superior in every way to their Japanese counterparts, would soon begin arriving in the Pacific in numbers that would overwhelm any remaining Japanese resistance. The strategic initiative had passed decisively to the Americans. who would use their victory at Midway as a springboard for the offensive operations that would eventually bring the war to Japan's doorstep. Admiral King, commander of the U.S. Navy, ordered plans prepared for amphibious assaults on Japanese-held islands, beginning the island-hopping campaign that would roll back Japanese conquests across the Pacific. The psychological impact of the defeat reverberated throughout the Japanese military hierarchy. Officers who had believed in the invincibility of their forces now faced the reality that American determination and industrial capacity could overcome even the most skilled warriors. The Bushido Code that had sustained Japanese morale through the early victories provided little comfort in the face of such overwhelming material disadvantage. Emperor Hirohito, in his private diary, recorded his growing doubts about Japan's ability to achieve victory in the Pacific War. The loss of the carriers represented not just a tactical defeat, but a strategic disaster that called into question the entire basis of Japanese war planning. The dream of establishing a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere under Japanese leadership was fading as rapidly as the smoke that had risen from the burning carriers. The Battle of Midway had demonstrated that wars in the industrial age would be won not by individual courage or tactical brilliance alone, but by the ability to replace losses and maintain sustained offensive operations. Japan, despite its early victories and the skill of its warriors, lacked the industrial base necessary to compete with American production capacity. As the sun set on Japanese naval supremacy, the smoke that had risen across the eastern horizon on June 4, 1942, continued to symbolize the turning point of the Pacific War. The carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor terrorized the Indian Ocean and seemed to promise Japanese victory across the Pacific had become funeral pyres for an empire's ambitions. The morale that had sustained Japanese forces through 6 months of uninterrupted victory had indeed crumbled with the smoke rising from Midway, marking the beginning of the end for the rising sun's dreams of Pacific dominance. From this point forward, every Japanese victory would be defensive, every advance a retreat delayed, and every battle a step closer to the inevitable reckoning that would come with the atomic dawn over Hiroshima and Nagasaki 3 years later.